Okay. Good morning and welcome to Gaming Ballistics Firing Squad. This is like a bookend for me. Once again, I'm joined by Sean Punch, line editor for the GURPS role-playing game and Steve Jackson Games. He is joining me here, as he joined me here 2 years ago, more or less, for my very first Firing Squad interview. To talk about what I think is one of the most exciting things to happen to GURPS since Sean completed the 4th edition rules in 2004, which is the announcement and Kickstarter for the GURPS Dungeon Fantasy role-playing game to be released in a 5-volume box set and is kickstarting right now, so go back it. Sean, welcome.
Hey, good. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, no, it's great to have contact with the content creators. And speaking of content creators, just to set the stage, I will be asking you a bunch of questions, some of which you've seen already, some of which I'll just make up on the spot as you say interesting things, as you always do. But I will be focusing on the content and the creation of the game, marketing and the Kickstarter and European shipping and all of that stuff. And how does one print out a box? I will leave to people who don't write games for a living. Or who don't write games. Yes.
Yes, 2 thumbs up for that. That's good, because otherwise you get a really boring interview out of me.
So
how does it work? I have no idea.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, next question. That makes it quick. So let's talk a little bit about it. So let's start and pitch this at someone who is walking into a store and sees this game on the shelf. So what is the Dungeon Fantasy role-playing game?
What it is, in a nutshell, is what pretty much every starter set ever has been. It is a role-playing game in a box with the dice, the maps, all the rules and adventure that you can start right away gaming with. And whether somebody likes that one or the box next to it or on the other side of it will be almost certainly a matter of art if they've never heard of Steve Jackson Games or of GURPS. They're going to look at it and say, okay, this looks pretty cool. I like this one. I'm going to pick this one, not this other one. And that's getting into the territory where already it's a little beyond my expertise, because I'm not an art director or I can't even draw a straight line. But we're hoping to make this a lot prettier than GURPS has been in the past. And this box in particular, Phil's invested a lot in making it look very nice. He really likes boxes, knows how they work and how they're designed. So that's the kind of item 0 right there. If you don't get that, if that doesn't happen, then it doesn't really matter what all those words in the box. Most people don't look too closely at those at first. So that's 0. Now, halfway between 0 and 1 is maybe they've heard of Steve Jackson Games, which is great then. They've seen Munchkin around, they've seen other games around, they see the big Steve Jackson Games logo and say, hey, Steve Jackson Games hasn't had a dyed-in-the-wool, full-blown RPG set in a box in a real long time. I'd like to pick that up because this could be pretty cool. And then all the way to 1, all the way across the bridge, we've got people who know what GURPS is, and they might see this and say, oh, this is obviously based on GURPS. It's got that Powered by GURPS logo on the box. Maybe it's actually doing something cool that GURPS didn't do up to this point. And they'll look at it and read those words, and they'll actually learn from those words that this is a game based on GURPS, but isn't GURPS. And they'll say, this is simpler and more unified than GURPS was. Maybe some of my friends who will never come to my place when I say the word GURPS will suddenly come over because that's awesome box, and I'll buy all the beer. But mostly it'll be the awesome box and the cool rules and things like that.
So you've alluded to it, and you've spent the better part of a year, I believe, in making it so. How would you say that this is simpler than regular GURPS? Actually, let's take a step back. Let's talk about GURPS. It's a funny word, but for 30 years or so, it has meant something. And Steve Jackson Games is one of the top 2 or 3 longest living, continuously operating gaming companies, since even the big dog in the room, the D&D crowd, has either, Paizo was created a few decades ago, and the company that published D&D, although obviously it's gone through 5 editions since it was published. Tell me a little bit about the basis of GURPS and as a role-playing game, and if you want to say, oh, what's a role-playing game, you can do that too, for people who, again, as you say, are walking into a store and saying, what is this box, and what is a GURPS, and what is a role-playing game?
Okay. the medium-length version. What is a role-playing game? Hopefully, everyone watching this interview is going to know the answer to that question. I'm pretty sure of that because this is a role-playing game blog you've got, and I'm a role-playing game designer, and our name's going to bring in role-playing game fans. For someone who doesn't know, that box actually does try to. Our box tries to explain it. And GURPS before it try to explain it. In fact, Steve's been very good about any role-playing game coming out of Steve Jackson Games, explaining what is a role-playing game somewhere in the game. So I'm not going to go into what it is, except to say that, yeah, that information is there, and it's always been there, and it's sort of underlines Steve's approach, which has been play his games. GURPS is 30 years old this summer, actually. This is the 30th birthday, I believe. Origins marked it, so that would have been in July. So it's a little over 30 as we speak. And it is Steve's first big RPG as Steve Jackson Games. He previously had a game, The Fantasy Trip, but he did that with metagaming, and that was in the era before Steve Jackson Games, and the rights of that are tied up in a way that makes it impossible for us to ever to redo it. But that's okay. Steve learned from The Fantasy Trip, made GURPS. GURPS has gone through 4 editions since back in the day, since 1986. And it is on its 4th edition now, which incidentally turned 10 a couple years ago. It's 2004 we released that. So we're well into the 2nd decade for the 4th edition, which is the edition I worked on. And in between, there were obviously 2 other editions, plus there was a revision of the 3rd edition. And I came on board around when we revised the 3rd edition in 1995, so with the game for most of its run. And throughout that time, GURPS has been really what I would call a game for experienced gamers. We made occasional efforts to simplify, but truth be told, it's a game with a lot of supplements, a lot of rules, and the sales of GURPS have been. They've always kind of pushed GURPS toward rules heaviness. I'm reluctant to say that because I know it scares a lot of people, but it's the truth. There were GURPS supplements about lots of historical and fictional subjects, and they were very engaging and very light and easy to read, and they're really talking more about settings and what ifs than rules. But as much as those gained the acceptance of the broader gaming community and captured the imagination of people who weren't even GURPS players and who used them in their games, the reality was those were never a significant fraction of the dollars coming in. The dollars were always brought in by diehard, dyed-in-the-wool GURPS fans who wanted the more advanced rule for the rule that was more advanced rule of the other rule, which is the more advanced system of the other thing. And we complied and brought that out and did it because that's fun too. It's a lot of fun to hack rules. You know that. I know that about you. So that's where GURPS was. But then we realized in recent times that as much as that is a wonderful thing, that we have fans that love rules, they love to hack rules, the reality is that the games industry in general is swinging more toward more casual gaming, more pickup gaming. People are spending less time investing in a rule set and becoming rules geeks and more time just trying to find time to play. And the internet's been wonderful for that, but the catch is you can't have super duper complex rules when you're interacting over a dodgy internet connection and you're relying on a little PDF in another window somewhere for your rules. So we realized that we had to lighten up on GURPS a bit, and Phil was the motivator here. He really wanted to see a GURPS set that would go back a little bit, wind things back a bit, and go back to I could pick this up and play it with my friends, and I could pick this up and play it with non-gamers who are my friends, more important. He wanted that to be a possibility, and that was my mission, I guess you could say. That brings us up to present. That was my mission when I came to this box.
Okay, so as you decided what was going to go in the box and what was not going to go in the box, or really, I guess, you've got hundreds of pages of GURPS basic set. You've got ray gun blasters, and you've got the thrusting broadsword. You've got I know that there's the picture out there that has GURPS asparagus on it, which is a funny joke, but there is a lot of material out there for any given subject, and much of it has been updated to 4th edition. So talk about the process that you used. What did you pick to go into the box, and what was your mental process or your thought pattern for saying no, yes, simplify? How did you make that work?
Okay, well, there's a low-hanging fruit, obviously. Things like the ray gun blasters and and machine guns and all the stuff that just doesn't really work for quasi-medieval fantasy. And I knew right away, okay, none of this needs to be here. So that just gets chopped right away. That was super easy. That's an afternoon's work for anybody who knows how to cut and paste and, more to the point, how to hack and slash. Then there were the rules that supported that, and I realized an awful lot of GURPS rules were written mainly to support higher tech stuff. I realized that the range combat rules, for example, just to pick one, were mostly built around shooting guns. And their entire class of statistics, entire rules, you only needed if you're firing a repeating firearm. And I'll shoot a bow, or to fling rocks from a sling, or to chuck. Doesn't require most of that stuff. So that was super easy too. That got mowed down, removed. I saw no reason to leave that in the off chance that someone needed a magical machine gun, because in the tradition of old-timey fantasy games, if magical machine gun shows up as a magic item, it has a special case rule that's in the rules for that one item. That's how things have always been done in fantasy, and there's no reason to have a whole game built around this level of complexity, because it might be one artifact someday that someone uses. So those were all the simple things. And then there was this sort of attended stuff, which isn't so simple, and which is kind of integrated into the game, and I had to remove it from the game seamlessly. A good example that's still on this subject would be tech level. In GURPS, the whole idea is that technologies are defined by these broad tech levels, and they're much more than just labels. They get used in formulas for how to calculate various values and things in the game. They are used as cutoffs for when you can and can't use a rule. They're used as indicators of when a point cost should change for an ability. They're used in a multitude of ways that are really quite complicated, quite involved, and really tell you this is a generic game meant to handle any genre, any setting, any time. And I removed that rule. There's no need for tech level, because the tech level of dungeon fantasy is tech level olden times, which is to say the mash of all the technology that fits into fantasy and none of the technology that doesn't fit into fantasy. And there's lots of real life medieval or even earlier than medieval stuff which doesn't fit into fantasy because it's too gritty or appeals to a need that no one has, because there's magic spells. And conversely, there's many advanced things which are fine in dungeon fantasy. Dungeon fantasy is a genre where gnomes make eyeglasses and telescopes, and people walk around with optics that didn't come along to what GURPS would call 2 tech levels later, and no one questions that. So, and the social view is the same way. So I had to integrate that, I had to bake that into the game. So now the game is tech level olden times, and that's just one example. But then there were the rules complexities, which I couldn't use simple tags. I couldn't use simple tags like, is this in genre, is this in period, or is this remotely useful for fantasy? I had to look at them and say, all right, is this something people want to do in a fantasy game? And that's where it gets hairy, because you have to decide, what does somebody really want to do in a fantasy game? In my fantasy game, I've had always been blessed with crazy players. They want to do crazy things. But I do know that there are fantasy games out there who are more serious, they're more into resource management and into tactics and into what I would call, I guess, very high complexity fantasy gaming. And I couldn't just chop the rules for things I thought, oh, this is, pardon me, too complex for my players, too complex for the people I usually have, because they may like it. So I had to go in and set pretty arbitrary cutoffs when things are getting too complicated. And when I ran into a rule and I knew in my gaming, people had said, oh man, you're opening the book, this is taking way too long. I said, this has got to be simplified. An example of that might be the rules for slams, running bodily into somebody, knock them over, beat them up, whatever. In GURPS, there's a very reasonable system for that. That is this extrapolation from the rules for collisions between vehicles, between falling bricks and people's heads, between whatever and whatever else. It's a collisions rule. And in fact, David Pulver, who designed that rule, made sure that you could, with some basic assumptions, emulate bullets and sling stones and things as collisions if you really wanted to. It's not a perfect match, but it's pretty good. So anything ballistic, anything that's sailing through the air, uses a very fundamental unified system that takes into account mass and velocity and all these good physical concepts. And it results in math on the fly, and it results on sometimes unintuitive results if you're more accustomed to heroic gaming. oh, I'm a huge guy. I ran into somebody. What do you mean he doesn't fall over? I mean, he doesn't fall over because you're not huge enough. Why am I not huge enough? I've got this high strength score. Yeah, but your low hit point score works against you here because that's what we're using to mean mass. Oh, so I'm not heavy enough. It's like, well, you know, you can pick whatever weight you want. It says right here on the page. So I'll be really heavy and then knock people over. It doesn't work that way. It got pretty messy. So I just changed it. So now, not to give too much away because I'd like people to actually buy and play the game, but it now is a rule system that responds more to expectations. That particular rule now depends on, all right, if I punch somebody, it's going to hurt. So if I run into them, it's going to hurt about the same amount more. Say my punch versus this other guy's punch, and his strength versus my strength, his size versus my size. So it's made another hand-to-hand attack, and it's been made more consistent with the hand-to-hand attacks you can do using other parts of your body and other methods. That's just one really lengthy word example. And the reason I pick it is because it took me all those words to explain the differences. But on the page, it's maybe this big now.
Right. Let me guess. Roll to hit, roll damage, make an effect.
Yeah, I tried to make that normal for attacks with some rare exceptions where you just can't get too simplified because then there's no contrast.
Right.
Contrasts.
So if I could ask, you might not be able to do this, but you alluded to something, and I think it'll be interesting to walk through. And if Christopher Rice is watching, that means he has to drink, because I have a verbal tick where I use the word interesting a lot. But it'll be interesting. I'm going to have him wasted before noon. If you could walk us through. So I'm Legolas or I'm Robin Hood. And I'm bringing this up because you mentioned that the range combat rules are simplified. If I want to shoot an orc with an arrow, because they're trying to kill the halflings, walk a beginner through how that's done, if you might. And the reason why I want to ask that in particular question is I think it'll highlight some of the differences that people can expect to find in the box, and you can be as glib-tongued as you like, so that people actually can't derive the rules and don't have to buy it. But I think the highlight of how shooting a bow and arrow is now simpler than it used to be would be useful to people.
Okay, I think bow and arrow a whole lot different. The big difference will be organizational. So people listening should understand that when I talk this through, it may not sound a whole lot simpler, but perhaps finding the information will be simpler. And that's actually a huge number of revisions are like this. So you have to understand that I didn't simplify rules where I could simplify their presentation. I tried to keep some of the details for people who like that kind of thing. But to shoot a bow and an arrow, we still turn-based combat. You're still going to ready an arrow, and you're still going to make an attack the turn afterward with that weapon. Anyone who's using a bow is going to have the right skills and talents to do so at that speed or better. It's simply not going to be the case that anyone's going to fumble around taking too long. And then you're going to say, I want to shoot that orc over there. And for the most part, the only thing that's going to matter is how far away the orc is. And you'll get a range modifier, you'll apply it to your skill, you roll against skill, and you'll shoot the orc. You won't shoot the orc. There's all kinds of situational modifiers like GURPS has. They could be applied. They're not talked up as much as they are in GURPS, and a lot of them just aren't there. I greatly simplified things, but I did not simplify away range, for example, because the only thing that differentiates a good shooter from a bad shooter in GURPS or any game based on GURPS is how far away they can reliably hit a target. You take that away, you're taking away all the fun of being an archer, really, because then the wizard could pick up a bow and shoot somebody the same distance away as you can, because it says right here, bow shoot this far, and there's this flat penalty for this far. And that's not much fun for anybody. So you would basically just tell the GM you wanted to shoot the orc, and the GM would find the penalty, and you'd roll against the dice, and that'd be it. One look up, one dice roll. Now, whether the orc gets out of the way or gets shot in the face, that's the orc's problem. But your problem ends once you shot the bow.
So could I take from that things like accuracy and bulk and a lot of the differentiators that are really fine-grained tuning to make a longbow different from a slightly less long bow, and a really long bow and a composite bow is really just subsumed into like the raw skill?
No, actually, I wouldn't assume that. I've left weapons relatively differentiated because I was told by several people when I was designing the game that cool weapons, and the differences between weapons are super important to people who are actually into playing the kinds of characters who use those weapons. And I remembered the lesson I learned a long time ago when I first started playing AD&D, which is that even though I think having 15 different polearms with obscure medieval names is silly, there are people who are really into that, and it was really important their arm wasn't the same as their Gizarm Bulge or whatever. And there is a certain quality and quantity for gamers. If the weapon list isn't long enough, it basically just says sword, bow, axe, they're going to think, well, this game is kind of boring. This game is kind of flat. I can't differentiate. My dwarf wants to use this big axe. It's got 2 blades and it's this long. Oh yeah, well, I don't want to do that. I'm a ranger. I'm using this small axe. I stuff in my belt and so on. So I left that differentiation in because I think that it actually makes the game more fun for people. And those who've got the money to afford the better weapons and the skills and the strength to actually use them will want them to be different from the weapons that any twit can go pick up for $5 at Joe's Discount Weapons trade or whatever. And I think that that was important to leave in. So I actually don't think I did not simplify the game in places like that. If I could be silly a bit, wherever the game gets super medieval, wherever it's really into the whacking and the slashing and the gouging and the stabbing, I left that complexity in for people because I think that's what fantasy gaming is to a great extent about. Whereas when people rules for dealing with smoke and bizarre tactical situations that are only going to come up in modern environments where people are hurling smoke grenades and hiding behind camouflage and running around with thermal imaging and stuff. Those things are gone because they don't matter in fantasy gaming. So that level of complexity in range combat has gone away.
Did you pull in GURPS Action 2? The GURPS Action series is hopefully one of the next box sets. But the GURPS Action series is another worked example, and it used the concept of range bands. Is that something that you took a simplified step to, or did you leave because it's the way to differentiate between 0 and 100 yards, did you leave that level of detail, or did you simplify that so that there are fewer penalties to consider?
I decided against range bands in the end because they're really great for firearms where the effective ranges are so huge that you kind of have to compress them or you'll get into tables that run longer than your forearm. But for a missile weapon that's hurled with human strength or gnome strength or giant strength or whatever, honestly, the ranges are a lot smaller and you can get away with a little more differentiation within those ranges. The longest bow shot you could realistically make with a player character built to maximum specifications, the best bow in the game, is peanuts next to your typical rifle shot. And a typical rifle could shoot only a fraction as far as, say, a dedicated anti-material rifle that shoots out to some insane range. And in order to put that anti-material rifle in the same game as a little Derringer in someone's pocket, you really have to compress the range bands, or you have a huge table and a lot of thinking to do every time you fire a gun. This does not come up with low-tech weapons to nearly the same extent. And I thought about it a bit, and I realized that if I simplify too much, fair to people who want to specialize in ranged weapons. So I decided in the end, no, because people with hand-to-hand weapons have tons of options. They can do crazy things to make it harder to defend, or hit some high-value target, or disarm somebody, and all these stunts. And we all know that every fantasy game out there is built around stunts, basically. People do fancy things all the time. And then if ranged people, all they could really do is shoot somebody or not shoot somebody, it's not nearly as interesting as if they could shoot before anyone else can. That's their shtick. So I decided to leave that in. And range bands would have obscured that too much for my liking. On the other hand, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say that's entirely fair. I mean, one of the couple things come into play. If it is dungeon fantasy, and if you're not wandering through the wilderness, if you sort of go from town to adventure, by and large, in my experience at least, ranges are limited to about, it's the size of a room, right? Maybe 30, 40 yards at most. And so you're really be really close versus the end of the room is probably really all the detail that you need, but having that detail is useful.
And actually, you touched on something that's kind of interesting, because here's a good example of why I didn't simplify it. Dungeon Fantasy, the box that I worked on for months and months, is mostly built around actually being in the dungeon, adventuring in the dungeon. The rules to get to the dungeon, but the outdoor wilderness adventures and so on that's future product if people want it. So right now, most of the fighting and action is going to take place in relatively short distances over in closer quarters than, say, even your typical country road. So for the most part, a very narrow band of ranges is needed, but that's not actually what makes it more fun or more interesting for people. The objection was never having to look up. Like, people who said GURPS is complicated, the real objection wasn't looking up a range modifier. That's simple. It's a simple lookup. It's like, how far away on a table, bam, bam, done. That was actually the easiest modifier to use, and really never a problem. The objection was to shoot a target at any significant range. The penalty got so big that you never hit anything, and it was kind of boring. And what this does is, well, you're in a dungeon, the penalties aren't going to get big enough that's going to really be much of an issue. It's less an issue of, do I hit the target, more an issue of, well, can the target duck? And I can cook my monsters so they're not very good at ducking, for example, so that becomes very productive to shoot at them. And a lot of the lamer monsters, of course, are not going to duck much.
That's cool. So I have to ask, because I wrote the book, how does grappling work? Just kidding. But I do. It is curious, because one of the things that we found out is that when you get grabbed by a big hairy tentacle monster with suction cups and teeth, it's a lot more fun if it's scary. So how are the monsters? Forget the grappling thing, because I have to mention it. But how are the monsters scary for the delvers in the new box set?
Well, making monsters scary is a huge amount of the fun of designing a game. I'll be blunt. And the monsters are all familiar monsters from Dungeon Fantasy, but what I think people are going to see is, just relative to other game systems, just how unpleasant it is to be mauled by something that's big and wants to eat you. GURPS fans, of course, will say, oh, it's not as deadly as, say, some mecha from the future or whatever. But the fact of the matter is that the majority of the monsters in there will eat you if you give them half a chance. And that's just largely a function of how the game is built. The game is built so, unless you're rich and have expensive armor, when something with teeth big enough to crush your head decides to bite your head, you probably get your head bitten and you may die. There's not billions of hit points as a buffer against that. So that's right there, right at the very core of the game. The way the combat system is imagined, just fighting is bad for you. You can get killed fighting. It can make you quite dead, or it can cost you body parts. And I left in the rules for losing body parts, left in the rules for getting dead. None of those things are out of question for even the bravest, most high-priced adventurer. The catch is that they got magical healing. They go back to town and say, oh, Joe's head's been bitten off. Could you please resurrect him? If they have enough money, they can do that. And since they may not have enough money, there are options for it, sort of, kind of resurrecting him. Kind of. Well, he won't be a zombie or anything, but let's just say that there's discounts possible at a cost, and leave it at that.
Discount resurrection just sounds like a terrible, terrible plan.
Ask Miracle Max. Anyway, so the monsters are deadly right up front, but also I tried to make an interesting combination of monsters in there. Like I said, they're pulled from the Dungeon Fantasy toolbox, so to speak, but I didn't just pull them at random. I pulled the ones I thought were fun and cool. And sometimes it's surprising what makes a monster scary to people. I cheap scary, where the monster shows up, everyone roll dice, and if you fail, you're scared, you're petrified, can't do anything. That's a boring kind of scary, because really it's just telling you how to roleplay your character. Nobody likes that. But if you're scary, if the monster's scary because, if I let this thing hit me, it's going to snap my expensive magic sword in half and then kill me. If I let it hit me, it's going to snap my sword in half, kill me, and throw my body to my friend who will also die. Then suddenly it's a lot more challenging to go up against these creatures, because you actually have to come up with tactics other than, I just stand there and use my really awesome sword to block all his attacks and stab him in the face. And I was asked online, so I'll bring it up. Dragons, for example, are a good example of monsters supposed to be scary. And rather than leave them kind of not so scary, which in the past some GURPS dragons in various iterations of the game have been, I made sure that they are serious contenders. If you want to go up against a dragon, you better be ready. And it's not because they just have big strength and can eat you either. They have all kinds of advantages that you don't have as a typical adventurer. They open their mouth, they breathe a big jet of stuff. The stuff's big. It covers a huge area. Unless you're very lucky and right at the edge, you simply can't avoid it. There's no saving throw to not get burned. You just get cooked. The question is how cooked you are and whether you were smart enough not to be standing in a tight group. So most of the guy who got cooked is the guy who's expendable. And they can fly. So unless you're in a dungeon where there's no significant overhead, no significant air above you, you got a problem unless you could fly or shoot arrows. And if you're shooting arrows, guess what? Arrows are not nearly as deadly as melee weapons for the most part. And the dragon's got thick armored scales, so you're going to have to chip away at that dragon. He doesn't have a million hit points. It just has enough hit points that chipping away is going to be really, really, really scary for you because that dragon's over there flying and dropping rocks on your head, casting magic spells, and whatever else it feels like doing that day. And the dragon is still a scary physical combatant on top of that. So you set things up so you can not have the dragon flying overhead and you're immune to fire because you cast that cool spell that makes you immune to fire. And you're all set and ready to go up against the dragon with spears and axes and things like that. Well, you still have to deal with the fact it's huge, it's strong, its slightest attack can hurt you, possibly kill you. And then, of course, there's the fact it can plow you over without even trying. I left in, for example, the rules for what happens when the dragon moves through where you are, and that's bad for you. And the dragons are big, so they will move through where you are. And there's no hit roll to hit you. There's no special way you can avoid this outcome. The only thing you do is hope and pray you can jump far enough or roll far enough not to get squished. And that's an example of how really big and scary monsters are frightening. But I also left in a little tiny Weasley monsters. I mean, orcs aren't particularly scary individually, but I made sure to mention that orcs don't show up individually. And in fact, I made sure to mention that orcs are kind of crazy military types, and they'll inevitably do unwise things. I couldn't resist the urge to say orcs have to. They don't feel it's a good fight unless they brought some stupid siege engine, which is really dangerous, shot it at you. There'll be a guy there who's inevitably, that's his job. So basically, a crazy machine gunner orc will be in the mob, and you have to deal with that.
That crazy machine gunner orc. I like that. So a couple things came up during that. Let's see. I'm gonna go fight a giant with a club. Can I parry that blow with a sword, or is that something where that's a great way to get your sword broken?
It's a great way to get your sword broken or not from your grasp. Both. GURPS has what I always thought were really elegantly simple rules for that particular problem. And rather than try to simplify them further, I just made sure they were easy to find. That's an example of a case where, if the player asks, gee, that doesn't make any sense. You could stop a huge giant club with a knife. How does that work? And that doesn't make any sense. That doesn't pass my reality check. And you don't have to worry about it because that rule's right there and says, okay, it probably won't work out that way. It probably will be really bad for your knife and for you and for the hand holding the knife if you do that. So that's the example where GURPS comes through with some simplicity I could keep. On the other hand, there's places in GURPS where it gets a little too complex. Size modifiers in GURPS can be as annoying and complicated as you like. Relative heights can get annoying as complicated as you like. I looked at those rules and I realized that to really truly have a completely by-the-book GURPS battle between a giant and a normal-sized human, you have different sets of rules that take into account the heights, independent of whether one is bigger than the other. Just the sheer fact that the giant's taller will cause this rule to be triggered. Then the size, how big a target am I swinging at? And then things like, is he grappling? Because if he is relative size, means something different than he's not grappling. And is he crouching down? Can I shoot over his head at the other giant? I realized that these rules were really, really popular with the sort of gamer who really liked extremely high detail combats, but they were honestly too much lookup, too much rule for somebody who wanted to see a monster as an opponent to be defeated to get to the next monster and get the treasure in between there. And so I tried to keep that part of it simplified. So when you fight a giant, the main thing is it's bigger, so it's an easier target for you. And it's stronger and huge, so you don't want to be parrying its weapons. That's it. That's all. There's none of this can I reach its nose kind of stuff. Obviously, there's no to the GM. The GM really wants to enforce that they can. But truth be told, it never stopped. You mentioned Legolas earlier. We all know recent imagining of Legolas in the movies. If something's giant, he just runs up and stabs it in the eye anyway. So that's the heroic reality. So rather than say you can't reach its eye with your sword, you can reach its eye with your sword or your arrow held as a knife or your whatever else, as long as you are willing to take the penalty to hit. That goes with that. Think the level of abstraction that the game needs.
You know, one of the things that I can't remember whether it was Jurgen or Roger. I think it was Roger pointed out that in a GURPS fight, unlike some other games, if you are taking hit points of damage, you are losing. You're not doing something that's normal for the course of a fight. Like if you know, it's like a health bar going lower, 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 lower. Okay, I finished killing the monster by the time I get to here. Is that something that what warnings would you, because most of your defenses are active defenses or dodges or things that get you out of the way of the blow without necessarily taking wounds, or armor, which again leaves you with hopefully no hit points of damage. What things will new players, you know, maybe old hats to role playing but new to GURPS, what are the paradigm shifts that they need to keep in mind at a high level to really, I won't say play the game right, because there's so many different ways to play, but to make sure that they're not fighting the way that the system works, so to speak?
Okay, well, the big one I'd say is that it's not about who has the most hit points and who loses the fewest before the end of the fight. It's really not a contest between health bars the way it is in a lot of games. It's more about using the resources you have intelligently. An awful lot of games, whether they say it explicitly or not, kind of imply that what the health bar or the hit points, or whatever you want to call it, what they really are, they represent stamina or your ability to get out of the way of trouble or whatever. And as you use up your stamina, you're ducking less efficiently, the third or fourth punch in the same spot is starting to hurt now. That part of your body's getting softened up and bruised and feeling kind of crummy, but you're not really taking internal injuries and so on. That's other games models. GURPS model is more along the lines of you can continue to do your cool stuff as long as you succeed at your cool stuff. If you start getting smacked around and start getting hurt, you could do cool stuff less as well. So there is, in effect, a depletion that takes place, and I wouldn't go as far as to call it a death spiral. People use that term, and I don't really like that term because it kind of implies that once you lose, you continue to lose and faster. And it really isn't the case in GURPS. If you get smacked a few times, you can still come out on top. It's just that you're going to have to use up perhaps more limited resources to do that. And there's all kinds of ways in GURPS that you can do that. For example, this is a fantasy game, so there's magic. So unless you guys, your group goes off completely half-cocked and brings no casters, which is bad in any fantasy game or any game I can think of. Actually, no casters is probably the worst possible mistake. You'll always have the ability to repair some injury in the field. It's not like some games where healing has to happen out of combat, or games where you have a limited number of heals, and once they're used up, they're used up. In GURPS, really a really good healer can continue to heal people and heal people and heal people and heal people. Of course, the healer is the one getting used up. So in effect, the team is taking hits to its health bar. It just doesn't realize it sometimes. Likewise, there are little traits in GURPS which allow you to avoid the one screw up you really would like to avoid. Everyone who knows GURPS knows what luck is. Well, luck is there. It continues to be in the game, and every single profession in the game has access to it. Some of them start out with it right away, sort of as a mandatory trait. That's there. So the first time you screw up anyway, if you're smart, you can bail yourself out of it with luck. There are also slightly more subtle ways of doing it. There's spells that provide you with a modicum of protection against bad fortune once, and there are spells that just make it easier for you to succeed at the stuff that keeps you alive all the time. So the interplay between magic and personal abilities and just being a smart enough player that you use the right things at the right time can all keep your character alive, or at least keep your character from getting too terribly dead. But the learning curve for that is hopefully not as steep as it was in full-blown GURPS, because what I tried to do is make it a little more obvious what's a good tactic and what's a bad tactic. I didn't do this through tons of examples, because one thing I've learned as a writer of games is that there's a large number of people who call for examples, and they love examples. But when you actually talk to people who play the game, you'll discover that a tiny minority read the examples. The examples don't actually enjoy much popularity. A lot of people see them as wasted words on the page. So I had to do is make it more in the writing of the rules, make the rules a little more friendly. And you'll know already, having played with Dungeon Fantasy as a GURPS product, but Dungeon Fantasy has a slightly more conversational, slightly more easygoing voice, and I tried to keep that voice going throughout the entire game, not just in places where, oh, you've hit a Dungeon Fantasy part, you can tell because suddenly it gets goofy. It's sort of a little more casual. I try to make things as casual as possible, and my examples are sometimes concealed within the rules. I make a casual throwaway reference to barbarians. The thing is, everyone knows barbarians are big and tough, so there's probably a reason that I put didn't say have the guy who's standing in front of the arrows to rescue his friends be, say, a skinny little thief. There's probably a good reason for that.
I think that's fair, and you know, there was a lot of back and forth in the forums and other places about what might have been perhaps an imperfect use of the word silly to describe Dungeon Fantasy. But two brief examples from my own games both involve Peter Del Orto. You know, in a Swords and Wizardry game, he wound up using a severed ogre head as a morning star, right? And that's a D. You know, he's like, oh well, you know, and so now he's a 2-weapon fighter, and he's, I think, swinging the ogre head around by its ponytail. Here's a not safe for work piece in the game that I'm writing. My players decided to take a trophy of some deceased. I think it was also an ogre. I don't know what it is about ogres that make their body parts interesting to collect, but let's just say that the thought that someone would buy anything, and so they took as a trophy the ogre's man parts. So if you want to call that serious role playing, be my guest. But that's what I remember from everywhere playing when I was 10 till now when I'm 40 something, older than I was. That's always been part of it. And I think if the game embraces the resource management challenge, which has always been at the core, I think, of delving, and the ability to do wacky, crazy stuff because it's fun, that you've probably hit the bullseye of the fantasy gaming market.
Well, here's the thing. The thing with fantasy gaming that's kind of mental, but it's nevertheless the case. The power levels really ratcheted it up, right? I mean, it's not insane. You've got people who are taking on 20 orcs by themselves with a blunt spoon, and they're succeeding. Why? Because they're an awesome fighter, and it doesn't really matter what weapon they have in hand. They're going to be awesome. And you've got people who can shoot fire from their hands and their eyes, their mouth and their nose, and any other part of them they want to shoot fire from. You've got people who can sail through the air. We used to use the term watching bad martial arts movies. It's like, what's going on with Jean-Claude Van Damme? Does he have a rocket in his butt or something? He's never actually touching the ground. His foot's just always in the air. He's just sailing around. When does he actually launch these kicks? But this is fantasy gaming. This is standard fantasy gaming stuff. And you can be completely serious about it if you want. No question of it. The problem is that if you're like most people, you eventually have little problems suspending disbelief when this kind of stuff's going on. So you can do two things there. You can either say the laws of physics are completely different and come up with a whole big long line that says, okay, this is how this universe works and it's perfectly normal in this universe and everyone accepts it and it's heroic. Or you can just sort of accept that, yeah, this is a little over the top even in this universe, and be a little tongue-in-cheek with it while still realizing, okay, we're still basically kicking in doors and murdering stuff, taking its money. I mean, that's not really funny if you really think about it. It's kind of, yeah, it's kind of harsh to say the least. But at the same time, you could temper that with the knowledge that, okay, these aren't real things. These are orcs and stuff. I mean, yeah, I can be politically correct to say orcs are people too, and they don't have to be evil, and it shouldn't be mean to orcs. But the reality is that they're caricatures of evil. They're the universal bad guy. They're kind of not really intended to be anything but targets for some sort. So that's sort of almost inherently silly. Because it's cranked up to such a high level of unrealism that taking it too seriously is going to hurt your brain, and actually it's going to backfire, and you're going to end up realizing, oh my goodness, this is super silly. Whereas if you admit the silliness a little bit up front, you can have the serious moments where you're having a serious conversation with you about how many villages you're going to get eaten. And it's actually very dramatic and real role playing and a real story and a real legend. You're going to remember it later. As long as you get it out of your head that before you had that conversation, maybe you fought 26 orcs with a blunt spoon.
So, as we sort of, what are the 2 or 3 things that you'd like people who have played GURPS before, or like myself, either own and or have play tested most of the Dungeon Fantasy line? So I've pledged. I've got the box set. I mostly play online, so I don't have the GM screen. But I also upped for a pyramid subscription because pyramid subscriptions are great. And I think mine's probably about to run out. So for people like myself who have been there, done that, why this particular set?
Well, there's a few things I could say, and they're all over the map. These aren't related things, and I'm going to just throw them out there kind of at random because normally I like to chain things together, but these aren't really tied in so well. Number one would be just completeness sake. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of, well, you see behind me all those books. They're most of those, I got them before I worked for Steve Jackson Games. I bought them as a GURPS fan, right? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars worth of books. I don't know how many books there are there. There's more here you can't see. So for me, just there's that right away. I can't stand not having everything that goes with my hobby. It's just one of those things. So if, like me, or like a lot of gamers, you just like having everything to do with GURPS, you're going to want it for that reason. That's probably the, I guess, from a marketing point of view, I bet the marketing director, if she were watching, don't say that, but it's the truth. We all have a level of collector mentality, and that right there will drive a lot of people toward this box. Getting away from that, there's also the fact that you might find that, well, GURPS has a book for everything, and Dungeon Fantasy has a supplement for everything. That's a lot of books and a lot of supplements. You're digging around in your hard drive for the PDF. You're digging around in your bookshelf for the book. That's an awful lot of content spread across an awful lot of pages when you want to play a game which is, hypothetically at least, one of the oldest, best-known, quickest-playing genres of gaming ever. And to be a little more compact, a little more compressed, a little more in one place. And the box will certainly give you that. It'll reduce to 5 booklets, 4 rules, 1 of adventures. So in effect, 4 rules game. You will, of course, not get all the detail that every GURPS book ever and every Dungeon Fantasy product ever provided, but you will get a playable game that certainly doesn't leave out basics and allows you to get right down to what's needed to play the game. For a lot of people, that will be a huge amount of appeal. For sort of, this is point 2A, for a lot of those people who still play physical game as opposed to online, there's the convenience of not having to lug it around. If you were lugging around the GURPS basic set, which is, well, I mean, I've got it here. I always have it here. It's this big. It's this big chunk of the book. The fatigue from my long weekend in my arms. Just 3 books. Now, the thing is that in order to cover all the weapons and fighting styles I might want, that's more books. And then there's the fact that I'll keep those in PDF. Already I'm feeling, so I've got a laptop or a tablet or something with those PDFs on it. Maybe it's about, you're really got a lot of money, you've got a really nice one that's really slim and compact. Maybe it's more like that. But anyway, the point is you've got that, and then the cables and the cords. And then you've got your dice, which come by the box load for most gamers, and so on and so on. Yeah. Or you can have this one box.
This is my GURPS dice box right there. Right now it's become right now it's my toddler's chew toy, and occasionally source of painful caltrips. But because she's like, I'm going to throw these dice at you, and so she's already the cavewoman dice chucker. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I have, and that's not my polyhedral set, right? That's my I need D6s because I play GURPS set.
Yeah. Well, all I'll say is that you want the quite as much stuff if you got the box. And the box gives you a place to put the dice and the pencils and the character sheet and all that. You could hypothetically, depending on how big a geek you are and how much stuff you like for gaming, carry it all in the box, carry it with you to someone's place. So that's another little point. Yet another point is you're going to introduce somebody to this game, perhaps. You're a GURPS geek. That's great. You've got walls. You've got shelf meters of GURPS books. You've got gigabytes of GURPS books. You've got your GURPS is measured in large units. Your GURPS is measured in sorts of units that are normally reserved for things like NASA projects and stuff. But perhaps somebody else will see that and react with anything gigantic and overwhelming. And that's going to be the okay, taking a step back and smiling and saying, yeah, that's a little too much investment in terms of shelf meters, dollars. I have to work out at the gym a lot more to carry this many books, whatever. Yeah, you know what? That's okay, Doug. I'll pull out some game that fits in a little tiny pocket box, whatever. Well, this does kind of factor just a bit because a single box has boundaries. It's only so big. It can only hold so much stuff. They're pretty sure when they open it up, it's not going to have 500 books come pouring out of there. They can kind of look at it and see the price tag on the side. They know how much it's going to cost. They know that, okay, what do I need to play this game? What's on that box? And it's a relatively colorful, attractive box with art on the outside. It's not something that's got a wall of text on the outside saying, this is a wonderful game about simulating and emulating and tracking and they're gonna see a cool looking fantasy game and it might actually be interesting to them. So they'll be selling it to your friend's point of view, which is also important if you're a GURPS player because you may actually want to have people play other games with someday. And lastly, I think if you're an existing GURPS player, you're going to really like the new content that's in there. I'm not going to lie and say it's tons of new content because that would be a little misleading, to say the least. But for example, GURPS Dungeon Fantasy, and in fact, GURPS 4th Edition in general, doesn't actually have really concrete rules for fantasy dragons, fantasy vampires, fantasy werewolves. And I put fantasy in front of purpose because there are rules for the folkloric or mythological versions of these things, but the fantasy version is different. The fantasy version has to be able to fight people in armor and basically go toe to toe and sling magic spells and stand up against magic spells. Those are in there. Dungeon Fantasy's never had much in the way of adventure support. Matt Rigsby gave us one adventure. Well, we paid him for it. He didn't give it to us, but he created one adventure and that was it. We kind of stopped there, and that's in part because GURPS players tend to be very self-sufficient, very rules hacker oriented sort of people, and they don't really need adventures, but new gamers do. So this is coming with an adventure, and if the Kickstarter gets backed, we will put more adventures in there and support it with more adventure content if people want that. Adventures are kind of fun to design, and I included one in the box. It's all new. It's not one anyone's seen before. That's in there. There's the rule simplifications I talked about at the very start. Those are really, in some sense, new rules. So they're in there, and they're not elsewhere in GURPS at all. And then there's a few other things that are very dungeon fantasy oriented that I put in there that are not in the rest of GURPS or even in Dungeon Fantasy. For example, some of the professions, the templates, what people call classes in other games. They're not built the same way entirely as the ones in the Dungeon Fantasy series because I wanted to make them more flexible. For example, anyone who's ever played Dungeon Fantasy knows that if a non-human race and a member of kind of an expensive profession at the same time, you don't have enough character points to do it. Well, I made sure that was possible. They also are aware that the bard was pretty, what's the word we're looking for? Over complex to the point of lameness at times. And that's my fault. I designed the original bard. So you know what? I say, this bard's got to be a little less lame. So I made him a little better at magic, a little less spread out among multiple abilities, a little more flexible and interesting as a character to play. So there's that.
For what it's worth, the 5th edition Ranger has gotten a lot of that flack. Because he's a beastmaster and he's a hunter and he's a spellcaster and he polishes his shoes really well. And so, when you've got, Thog the Barbarian, whose job is to hit things with swords, and then you've got this other guy who's like, I have 5 jobs. He's never going to be as good. So I think that it's a common mistake to put many small amounts of awesome into one ability, and you find out in a game with a heavy investment in niche protection, which has always been a staple of the genre, that if you occupy too many niches, you're not terribly good at any of them.
Oh yeah, that's definitely true. And I tried to make it so the people, the professions which did more than one job, I try to make it so the jobs were a little closer together, and the point investment and the stuff that was kind of peripheral was a little smaller. For example, Peter Delorto, who wrote the Dungeon Fantasy Denizens Barbarians book, really inspired me because his barbarians in there, the stock barbarian is in there, but also barbarians who are more combat oriented than outdoors oriented. And I realized deep in my heart that as much as I like the idea of the outdoors oriented barbarian, because in the proto game that's led to Dungeon Fantasy, there was such a character, fighting is super important to most players. And if I'm being honest, the player of that barbarian liked fighting a lot. In fact, she actually had her barbarian rip the leg off of a bad guy and use it as a flail. So I don't think it was an ogre, but you get the idea. So ripping body parts off using as a flail, yeah, kind of important. So I made sure the barbarian in the box a little more combat oriented, a little less outdoorsy. Not that he's not an outdoorsman, but a little less so. And I made being an outdoorsman slightly more interesting by making the baseline capabilities of it a little broader for the same points. And I did that a lot. If I saw something was expensive in terms of character points and wasn't giving people much, I kind of made it a little more useful. So there'll be, hopefully, if you're a GURPS Dungeon Fantasy player and you're used to some of the flaws that you had to make house rules to work around in Dungeon Fantasy being a little bit annoying to you, you'll find that some of those at least have been addressed because I read. It's one of those funny things about being an editor. I read, and one of the things I read is thousands of posts about our products. And when I see there's a recurring theme, this is pretty lame. I wish that Sean hadn't done it that way. I could take the message and change the thing I didn't do the way that they would have done, within reason. I mean, I'm also a gamer, so ultimately I'm right all the time and everyone else is wrong. So some of my things are.
Well said. I do want to hit on something because you alluded to it on can't remember if it was a forum post and you sort of mentioned it here. But one of the things, so I review GURPS products as well, and one of the things that I'll say about a lot of the characters books, whatever, I have a real time digesting a 250 or 400 point wall of text, and somewhere in the previous conversations that I've seen, there was an allusion to a layout decision, perhaps, on the templates. Are they a little bit more easy to digest and read?
Well, Nikki, who's doing the layout, would probably call it my decision because I unilaterally decided this and then hoped and prayed and made cute eyes that it would be accepted. But it was. And that is that the templates would be a little less wall of texty. It's not a huge change. It's a couple of what I would call modest propositions that I think will make it easier to get into creating a character. One of them is simply to open things up a bit from lists. Lists are still there, but they're not simple text lists. They're now more visual. I think it'll be more apparent what your alternatives are, what the choices are. If nothing else, it won't be like some guy throwing a sales patter at you. What would you like? Would you like a cheeseburger, double cheeseburger? You want it with sauce, without sauce? You keep fries on that. Super slice your fries. You want some Coke? What sort of Coke you want? Oh, okay. What's that? Okay. What does she want? She wants something different for you. Okay. Instead, it'll be kind of like a menu you can sit down and read. Be more polite. You'll be kind of like tonight's dinner serving. Because this is the following wonderful creations from our chef, and a list, and a little bit of a break to the next list, so you can actually see what's going on. And the other change is when there's what I would call some of the categorizations that were used, well, they were really great for GURPS, and they were really great for templates. They were perhaps not so useful for actually knowing what's important to your character. For example, I had years ago created a template system where we had primary, secondary, and background skills. And that's wonderful in the sense that it says, this is super important to my profession. This is kind of important to my profession. And this explains what I was doing before I got a profession. But I realized when I was working on Dungeon Fantasy box set that, well, most people they're going to think this way. Here's the skills for beating stuff up. Here's all the not quite as exciting skills that I have to have in order to be a legitimate member of my profession. And here's a bunch of random choices that I can make just to make my guy different from the other guy who does the same job as me in this group. And there's still maybe 2 or 3 skill lists, but they're not broken down in that way. So each of those primary, secondary, background skill lists would have mandatory selections and choices off a small number of bullet items, and then open choices off a long wall of text list. And I said, okay, so we have 3 sorts of choices under 3 categories. That's 9 things already. Or I could just say, here's all the fixed stuff near the top. Here's all the choices. And here's all the other choices. And the first set of choices are professional, second are not. And if it's mandatory, it's there. Combat stuff is in one place. Professional stuff you have to take is another. And free selection is a third. You're not making tons of choices anymore. You're basically picking off a couple lists. Yes, this meant that some things that formerly were required by professions are now kind of optional. I think you could probably make a ranger who's not very good at being a woodsman if you really tried now. But that's almost acceptable because you've got a situation. No, it is acceptable because your situation where most adventuring is happening down a hole in the ground and there isn't any woods to be a woodsman in. So it's probably a good thing that a scout can, if a scout wishes, be mainly an archer and kind of, oh yeah, I do some woodsman stuff too when I'm not being an archer. And totally leave off the polishing shoe skill you mentioned earlier. It's like, yeah, I'm not that kind of scout. I'm the kind of scout who doesn't wear shoes. It's all possible. And it's the same with non-humans. I try to make sure that that I left out the ones that were over complex and tricky and finicky, and I tried to keep their abilities with their descriptions. And actually I did this with the professions too. So another little plus to the system I've got here is you're no longer going, and if you are a scout or if you're a wizard or whatever, you pick this many points and these cool abilities, and you have to proceed to go to the GURPS basic set to look up those abilities that only scouts or only wizards can have. And if you've got a cool power, it's like, oh, and the power is defined on this separate page, which points you to a whole bunch of stuff, which is the basic set, which you then have to modify using modifiers in order to find your power. Now, you just now look under your template, and here's all the stuff that you can do with its point class descriptions right there. And if that meant I described an ability twice occasionally, twice, and if the thief version and the scout version weren't quite the same, then they get described with different color. That's fine too. There's no reason, because it's not a generic universal system, to just refer everyone to a core mechanic all the time and say, yep, you can do this, but you do the thief version. It's more fun that way, and it keeps everything in one place.
You know, and that was something that I ran into in my game design flirtations is people don't mind repetitive text if it keeps the game moving along. And that includes everything from in play to, because GURPS is a front-loaded system. GURPS is a front-loaded system. You do the work ahead of time, and then ideally you're not doing all of the stopping and calculating and whatever that you might have had to do. And that's going to get, this is a segue into another question. But repeated text that makes it convenient to just play and roll and shout, to borrow a phrase, is almost universally appreciated, especially since, you know, you're not paying by the word, you pay by the product. But that leads me into, I have a box set. I set it down on my table. I have 4 friends. From taking off the shrink wrap to killing my first orc or the first rat, because you always have to kill rats in a cellar somewhere, I guess. How long of a setup for a typical 4-person party with a game master? Assuming that I have done role playing before as a game master, so that I don't have to figure out, hey, what's this dice thing? What do you think that the time would be from opening the box to actually play?
I think it'll depend a bit on a couple of things. One of them is the experience level with point build systems, because there's still point build, and if you don't do point build, if you're not familiar with it, it might take you a couple hours to set up before you're really playing the game. If you do point build, a whole lot less than that, because you'll know how it works. That's the big divider. The other divider is how many, you know how every game group's got that guy, and it can't decide what character he wants to play. So he sits there and paws through every single option, looking at the rule book until, yeah, one of these guys. And then halfway through you're making your character, grabs the book from you, say, no, I changed my mind. there is a lot of choice, and if you get that guy in your group, it'll also take a couple hours rather than less than an hour.
But
if you've got a group,
I think that's true. If you know
oh,
that same guy is the same guy who takes 3 hours to order his food in a restaurant.
it's true. The differences of point build systems give people like that a little more rope with which to hang everyone else.
Yes.
Well, I think it's everyone else that gets hanged. They're having a great old time, but everyone else is pretty much a zombie by that point. So I do think, yeah, there is room for a indecisive, somewhat selfish person who's really big on economizing every last point and doing everything exactly by the book to hold it up for everyone. And that's an unfortunate result of point build meets indecisive or selfish player. If you've got a group who's determined to play quickly, nothing is going to slow it down. I'd say that you could take a template pretty much as written, make the choices, and go with it. And you could be playing the game in whatever amount of time it takes you to write down the important abilities on your character sheet. I could probably do that in minutes. Maybe somebody who's not used to it take a little longer, but they're not fussy about being editorial quality character production with exactly the stats formatted just the right way. They're just writing down, I can swing a sword at skill level X. It won't take very long. Equipping your character could take a little longer depending on how fussy you are, but honestly, you don't have enough money at the start of your career to buy that much stuff. Once you bought armor and bought a weapon, you pretty much spend all your cash. And armor is available in big suits, so you don't have to spend time. My left glove behind the hand has this armor. On the palm, it has this other armor. Now, my right glove, I don't wear a right glove because I don't have a right hand. Instead, I have this special hook. It's none of that. It's you buy suit armor. Done. Your weapons are there. You're not going to have enough money to buy 20 weapons. And the way GURPS works, you don't need 20 weapons because you're only going to have skills for 2 or 3 weapons. So at most, you're going to have 2 or 3 weapons. And because the system largely dispenses with really detailed outdoor survival and stuff, you don't really have to have. We have 17 tent poles and 43 tents, and we've got this many frying pans and this many fish hooks. It's abstracted enough. You don't really have to get into that. So equipping your won't take all that long either. I think the GM will have to, at the first time with any new group, sort of talk people through a bit. Here's what I want to do. Here's the kind of group you probably want to aim for. Oh, what you're doing here is going to work out. That negotiation is maybe the biggest wild card because experienced GMs tend to have huge expectations, and a twisted irony is an awful lot of GMs complain about games being slow are exactly the sorts of GMs who are super experienced and have big expectations and spend all kinds of time giving their players all kinds of special rules that aren't in the book that they also have to live up to. But the beauty of Dungeon Fantasy Box Set is that it's I won't say it's designed around without a GM because it isn't, but it's definitely designed so that those points in GURPS where it's like GM may decide this, the GM could do that, the GM can say the other thing, they're really downplayed, they're really not cast in the spotlight in the box. So hypothetically, you can play canonical stuff right out of the box and not have too many troubles. And to make that work, I've removed certain well-known and famous abuses of the rules. They're not possible in the box set the way they are in GURPS. There's certain spells that will not let you be super powerful. There's certain items that will not work the way they do. If you are the sort of person who thinks this way, you can, the example recently came up, the loincloth of vulnerability. Because GURPS erroneously defines the groin as being this humongous part of your body area, and because loincloths cover your groin, even though they're cheap and light, you could effectively earn a loincloth. Well, you can't do that now. So you're not going to have abuses where someone's going to say that. Likewise, there's certain abilities which are just overpowered under certain readings, and I made sure to cut those off at the roots. So you simply can't have that reading now. That reading doesn't exist. I rewrote those rather than leave in dodgy wording that may date to the dawn of GURPS. So hopefully, if GMs trust their players, they can get started pretty quickly. I'm still not going to make claims some people like to make. Oh, you could be making 4 or 6 characters, have a rollicking adventure underway within an hour of opening the box every single time. I think that's physically impossible just because we can't include 4 copies of the player book in there, the character making book, without jacking up the price to stupid levels. So just the fact that you have to hand the book around means it's going to take a little longer than that.
Right.
But on the other hand, I don't think you're going to have to spend all your time doing that stuff.
Does the adventure or the adventurer book have 4 or 6 pre-gens? Here's a fighter, a scout, a magic user, and a cleric. Go kill stuff.
I didn't include pre-gens, and I'm not entirely certain how I feel about that, but one thing was said to me by our marketing people at one point when I was talking about pre-gens, and I actually agree with this. Say pre-gens are the sort of thing we can give away. We can put them on the site. In fact, we can have gamers just creating characters, and they can be shared anywhere. And realize these days, honestly, nobody's very far from digital most of the time. And if someone really wants a pre-generated character, they can get one. And the big thing with pre-generated characters, and I realize this now, an awful lot of there's 2 problems with them. One is that a lot of players don't like to play a pre-generated character. They want to play their character. In fact, for a lot of players, this is perverse pride in trying to cook the systems. Their character is just that much cooler. And you can't really take that. I don't know. As a gamer, I find that incredibly fun sometimes to try. So there's that. And the other thing is that pre-generated characters are what I would call low value per page content. They're we'll use once, and a lot of people can create their own character just as well, or at least they think they can, as some game designer or some writer. And so they're feeling like, gee, that whole page is given over to this guy who's like, well, his name is William the Wonderful, but we call him William the Weak because no one designed a character that lame. And so I stared away from it in the end, which isn't to say that if people really, really wanted pre-gen content, it couldn't come along at some future date. It's simply to say that putting it in the core, weighing it a bit, I decided, you know what, probably not.
I'm gonna make it both a bet and a challenge. I'm gonna bet that the GURPS character assistant people, within a month, but maybe within 2 weeks of having the box set and the alternate rules hit the floor, will not only incorporate the new choices and flavors into GCA, they'll have it formatted properly with whatever the new layout is, and distribute a file that will allow people to generate pre-formatted pre-gens and put them online. And I would bet that happens very quickly. The GURPS community is very animated, and apparently it's let's hit refresh here. It's $65,534 worth of animated with 23 days to go. So, yay. But I bet that very quickly there will be a large body of available content for things like, hey, if you want to spend 10 minutes, pick from these 4 fighters, these 4 barbarians, these 4 scouts, these magic users with some pre-generated spells. Here's a fire wizard. Here's an earth wizard. Here's a whatever wizard. Here's a pyrex wizard. And the hit him with my mace cleric. And good. Now you can actually play with relative newbies within an hour of opening the box.
Yeah, I think that's possible and likely. I think that if I have a spare moment, I'm certainly going to take a crack at making a few characters, throw them out there just for people to have. I think that what you said very early in the interview about, okay, what does this give me if I've already played GURPS? What does this give me? I haven't already played GURPS, so on. Well, one of the things about GURPS that's really attracted people is the character creation. For an awful lot of people, it's a mini game in itself, and I think allowing people to play the mini game and share that with their friends is great. But I think we have to be careful not to play it to the point where there's only one true way to do something, and every thief afterward looks exactly like this thief that was in this book one time. And I really want to avoid with this game doing what some other games do, which is there's one true way to build the character. I've run into this playing other fantasy games, especially digital ones, which necessarily simplify the rule set, but even face-to-face ones, where you make a character you want and you think it's going to be fun. Everyone just looks at you and says, oh, well, yeah, but you're not going to be able to 15 levels down the road do this one cool thing, which is the only reason to ever play this kind of character. And you're kind of pushed in that direction by the community itself to not play that. GURPS is great as a game because it really doesn't have any one true way, but GURPS has too many ways to be easy to grasp if you're new. the box somewhat limits the number of paths, so it's saying there's only one path. So I hope that people coming will embrace the box because of that, because you haven't asked me this yet, and I'm going to take the initiative, but the two things that this box offers that other role-playing games perhaps don't offer. One is a greater diversity of character designs. You can make the character you want within reason, probably even outside of reason. And then the other is that a sufficiently flexible set of rules for actual gameplay that you can handle situations that aren't strictly speaking according to Hoyle dungeon situations. In fact, the actual intro adventure starts in an inn, and I'll leave it at that. But it doesn't actually involve your classic dungeon, although it involves classic fantasy situations found in dungeon games. And I'm trying to show off the fact that this game can handle a broader range of situations. When you say my character wants to do this cool athletic stunt, the GM isn't just stuck kind of looking at you with this petrified look saying, well, I don't know how that's going to work, so let's just say you do it, or let's just say you don't do it. There's no risk, there's no reward. That's boring. So the rules support more options that way, right out of the gate. So the character options coming out of what we discussed with pregens will hopefully they'll give people this idea, hey, this game's cool. You don't just play these classes or whatever. You can play kind of the guy you want to play. You kind of have the alter ego you'd like to have. And then in the game, they'll discover, hey, and the fact I chose these abilities, which are kind of off the wall, and perhaps not frontline abilities that would seem apparent for this character type, there'll actually be reward for having made those choices. It won't be kind of, oh, great, I went and invested my entire budget in this totally useless ability, which no one will actually let me use, will never come up. So I've set things up so that
one question to see, just because there was a supplement called Divine Favor, which I think is my favorite clerical, religious, holy magic system that I have encountered or played in 30 years of gaming. Now hopefully, maybe you're going to disappoint, but is a cleric or a healer just a different kind of wizard, or is there some of the flavor that came along with some of the optional subsystems in both Pyramid and some of the supplements that got brought into it? How are a fireball wizard and a healing wizard or a cleric different?
Well, it's interesting you should bring that up, because that's something I thought about. I will be blunt and say they're both casting spells in the magic system sense, the GURPS magic system sense. I did not go into the alternative magic systems. There's a very good reason for that, which I think you'll appreciate when I lay it on you, and that is that the more magic systems people have to learn, the more advanced the game is. And simply put, Divine Favor, while it's a very cool system, is a completely different system from magic spellcasting as learned skills. And that's two sets of rules to learn if you have them both in the game. And on top of that, the Divine Favor system, its guts are one of the most complex subsystems of GURPS ever. And in order to really understand it and deal with it when it doesn't work well, you have to know that system. I looked at Divine Favor and I quite like it, but it's got one flaw, and the flaw is that there are lots and lots of GM adjudications called for, and they require understanding the power system and the modifiers intimately. And if the GM doesn't understand those things, when a call comes up, a rules call comes up, it's very close to possible to make it fairly. And in order to give a new GM who's never seen GURPS before the tools to make that call fairly, it requires leaving all that stuff in the game, unfortunately. And so I thought it through, and I said, you know what? This box is going to have the basic set, the magic book, and the first couple of Dungeon Fantasy volumes summarized in it, and the vast reams of content. There's 25 Dungeon Fantasy supplements, all told, and countless articles in Pyramid. If I included all that content, including the alternative and spin-off magic systems, it would fill 8 boxes or something, and it would be very complex and very detailed. So I had to make that call, and that's how I made it. I think that people who are advanced rules hackers absolutely come in and put their version of the Cleric in that uses those systems and rules. But I think if they do, they're going to have to understand that if they've got new players, they're adding a whole new system that maybe is going to confuse them a bit. So I kept it there. And I think it was the right decision from a rules complexity point of view. I know that existing GURPS fans who geek out about lots and lots of content and lots of options and subsystems are going to say, oh, that's too bad. But they're not the only market or even the first market for this game. The first market for this game is definitely people who don't play GURPS, because the whole point of this Kickstarter is to find out how viable GURPS is in the future going forward with people who aren't the converted, who aren't in the choir already. So yeah, so I try to keep that content out of there.
I think that's a great point. You know, the thing that actually thinking about it and putting my designer hat on, I agree with you completely that the most complicated part of GURPS is the power advantage modifier subsystem. You get things like, you know, innate attack, and then again, wall of text of all the different modifiers to turn it into a particular innate attack. And they're picky and they're great, both great and awful discussions on the forums about that. The thing that I like about the Divine Favor system, and I'm already sculpting a pyramid article in my head about this, is the request for aid. The petition role, I think, makes it unique. As opposed to casting a spell, you say, I'm going to ask, you know, Fum the Walk God to bestow upon me this power. And I'm thinking maybe you could probably take that same basic spell casting system and just mod it with a petition role. I'm asking for the energy to cast the spell. And if you get it, you don't have to deplete your own energy because God has provided it. So I think that there might be a way to make a simple. Of course, the last time I said I can write a 1,000-word article, it turned into the Deadly Spring. So I will never say that again. But I bet that there are some fun ways to add some flavor that will be entirely within the and start playing in 15 minutes type of concept.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's probably the goal. I just think that throwing too many systems at new players out of the gate is very risky. And
yes. No, I agree.
There's other thing, which is not to put too fine a point on it, but probably the best-selling, most popular fantasy game of all time, more or less has the same spells for everyone, and mostly, can this type of caster use this spell? Yes, no. It's pretty much that simple. And I think in its most popular iteration, that game was very, very clear on the fact that everyone was under the same general set of restrictions. They had to cast spells. They could only cast so many spells. Their spells were scaled to their current power level, and the spell of this kind of caster and spell that kind of caster essentially had the same parameters on them and so on. What made them different was more that they advanced in different ways and had different tricks outside of their spells. And I decided that would be for new GURPS player who's not a new gamer. I decided that would be the most familiar model. It's like a case where a cleric and a wizard and a druid can all cast spells. They're all spellcasters, and the spells are in the same book of spells, and the spell casting process works the same way. You roll dice against the number, and you spend some energy, and so on. What makes them different is the conditions on when they continue to cast their spells. If the cleric's not been a very good cleric, his god's not going to support him. If the druid is really far from nature, the magic's not going to be as strong. If the wizard's somewhere where the magical hand-waving energy fields aren't strong enough, that magic's not going to work very well. But everyone's got strengths and areas of strength and weaknesses and areas of weakness, and both in the personal sense of area and the sense of the place is different. And then there's energy, and the energy is kind of a resource, and letting people track one resource and understand what this resource is simpler than saying there's different kinds of resources, and one guy is using energy from within, another person's got to mark off these strange, I don't know, pointed sticks or whatever he carries in a little pouch and shakes out in the ground, and a third person's getting the energy from everyone around and leeching them or vampirizing them in some way. And you have to record these all differently, and then you have to keep track of the number of pointed sticks and the number of gray hairs you got from using up too much energy and so on. And people get really glassy-eyed when you have too many resources. So you can have the resources being essentially the same thing, energy points, but you can still have it so that the energy points wizards use, the energy points clerics use, come out of a different bin. So there's a reason to say have two sorts of spells if you can swing it, and there's a reason of two sorts of people in the group if you can swing it. And sometimes this caster will be more useful in this environment, and this caster will be useful in this other environment. But it's tricky stuff to say two magic systems work so differently that they can't be seen in terms of similar resources and similar outcomes, because then you get a situation where people can't compare the capabilities of two different types of characters, and like it or not, people do. They do measure. How's my character doing? How's Joe's character doing? How's Jane's character doing? How's Amanda's character doing? Oh, they're all doing better than my character. Why? Because their character picked a system which is easier to use or works better or whatever. And I try to avoid that being a likely outcome in the box.
I think it's very important too, because and it's not just a matter of, you know, whose spell list is bigger. It's a matter of fun at the table. If every time the thief sits down to pick a lock, the wizard just casts the Alohomora, right? The anti-lock spell, and is always better, and it casts no energy, and you've just invalidated the point of having a thief. If the wizard can always cast Scry Eye or Doug's floating eyeball or something, or Rocket from the Socket if you're a Tick fan, and obviates the need to have the sneaky spell casting, the sneaky scout go up in front and be point man, then really what you need is, you know, a bunch of people to carry stuff and a wizard. And you want each player, not character, to have fun at the table. That's why you're there. If you really just wanted to do it yourself, then you could go play a computer game.
Yeah, this definitely the case. And for example, in Dungeon Fantasy, sure, there's a spell for opening locks, but the catch is it's only going to work on locks you can open with magic. So if there's no magic in the area, or the lock itself is made of the mechanism is made of something magic can't affect, too bad, so sad. Now the cleric come along and say, but my magic works on this stuff. And here's the problem: clerics don't learn breaking into locked doors spells, because it's not what clerics do. Clerics learn healing people stuff and blasting people with the power of their god stuff, but opening locks is not really cleric territory. So they stand there, the two of them, looking at this lock, saying, well, my magic's not going to work on this lock. It's made of meteoric iron. Yeah, well, my god doesn't let me pick locks of magic, so screw you. So we're looking at this lock. Well, we could kick it in. Neither of us is exactly big and beefy enough to kick in a door like this. All right, so where's the option? Option one is Barbarian comes and kicks it. Option two is we want Stealth and Thief comes and picks it. So there's a reason to have Barbarian there and a reason to have Thief there. And of course, there's the other thing where even if it's a plain old ordinary lock, you can use magic. Okay, fine, you use your magic. The lock opens. The door is now open. Great. You used up some of your magical energy to open it. And when you open the door, 800 squid golems attack you, and you need that magic not to die. Well, too bad, because that 799th block the squid golem spell you needed, you can't cast it, because guess what? You used the energy earlier on that door. Thief's fine. Thief's dodging and ducking, because Thief's really agile and can do this without spending any energy points. So who's getting the last laugh? So I've set it up so, at least in use, granted, a sufficiently determined jerk can more or less make everybody else's character useless. That's not something you can avoid in any role-playing game, but that's a social problem, not a gaming problem. But in as much as I can support the other gamers not letting the jerk have the jerk's own way, it's been done that way.
One last question that you sort of mentioned, maybe alluded to. There are different pools of power. Is there like a priestly energy reserve and a mage energy reserve, and then there's the get tired energy reserve, or is it all just come out of fatigue? In the new set?
You'll be familiar with the concepts if you've played Dungeons & Fantasy. Energy reserves are there for casters. They can always use the personal energy. The key thing is that we're in GURPS up to this point, personal energy was sort of the only asset, and later on you get really powerful and you can maybe have magical energy if you really wanted to spend the points on it. Right from the start, if you want, you can spend points on magical energy and have that in reserve and not use your personal physical energy. And that's how it's set up from the get-go now. I did not create a separate pool of energy points, because something we haven't really touched on in this interview, but which is still the case, is that compatibility with GURPS is paramount. If I decided spells come out of the spell reserve and fatigue points can't be used, that would pretty much make the game incompatible with all of GURPS. So I can't do that. It's not an option. The option is to just make sure both assets are available, but now if you're smart, you'll use the asset which is less draining and less harmful to you. If you're not smart, you don't have, or you just feel like an extra challenge, you don't have to do that. That's your personal choice. But I kept it compatible in that sense. Which said, it's also the case that I've played up much more now exactly how energy works. So for example, It's spelled out. There's 4 places energy can come from. It can come from your personal reserves, fatigue. It can come from the energy reserve you only use for casting spells. It can come from your life energy if you're really desperate and really want to die to cast a spell. Or it can come from some item that holds a reserve of energy for you. Your choice. You can mix and match however you like. Each one has its upsides and its downsides. Your personal fatigue reserves make you tired, but they come back for free pretty much. Your energy reserves come back for free, don't make you tired, and are awesome and wonderful, probably the best, except that they cost points above and beyond. Everyone starts with fatigue points, but that magical energy points, you have to pay for them. You get 10 fatigue points just for being alive. If you want 10 magic points, ka-ching, you have to pay. Hit points, using your life energy, well, everyone gets that for free too, but hey, you die because you do this. Not so good, maybe. And then finally, there's reserves in items, which great. They don't kill you, they don't make you tired, they don't cost you any points. Everyone starts with some, it's awesome. You get your magic hat and it gives you energy, but it's a one shot. You have to go back and get it charged up if you want to keep using it. So you got to measure that resource against the need to use it. And then if you want to recharge any of this stuff, there are ways to recharge it. You recharge some things with money, other things with magic spells, other things with potions, you know. So if you're a wizard or an other caster running out of magic, it's not likely to happen. But you still have to make important choices about using up resources. And other characters won't have to do that. They'll just do their stuff. So what's better for you depends on what kind of player you are. But it's for sure the case that if you're a caster, you're going to be tracking more stuff and playing a more tricky character than if you're not a caster. But I don't think anyone who's ever played a fantasy game ever would find anything surprising what I just said. It's like, I don't know about you, but the first time I play any new fantasy role-playing game, I just play a basic fighter with an axe because it's way easier. There's no weird systems to learn and stuff. I just find it way easier.
No, I agree. Actually, the last couple of games that I've played stabby types, and I like playing I like playing the scout. I'm a decent scout player, and I like the fighter types actually, and I'll tell you about it later. So high level, we have a box set, and all of the last 90 minutes that we've talked about is irrelevant unless the Kickstarter funds. So everybody go out and support the Kickstarter, because this is, I think, a straw poll on printed GURPS products. Steve Jackson Games knows how PDF works. Been doing it for years. It's sustainable, but not necessarily something where it's attracting a lot of investment. So I think the one important thing that we haven't talked on, because it's marketing related, is that all of the cool stuff and all of the rules and all the everything really only comes to fruition if we throw another $35,000 in the kitty. So I think that's the high level. But we have a box set, and it's a focus set of rules that can be added to with the existing GURPS body of stuff, but it can be played as is, and it's enhanced by 10 years plus of knowledge from 4th edition. I guess to that end, why don't you? I'm going to give you the last word. I sort of recapped the high level of what the box set is supposed to do. Viability of print rather than PDF. You've referred to it in other places as kind of a almost approaching a GURPS 4.5 because it is so focused, and you did add new content to make it playable as is in its own idiom. To borrow a Monty Pythonism, because you can't talk about role-playing without Monty Python, I suppose. So what should people leave with? What should people, as they finish this interview and are walking away with a thought, what thought do you want them to walk away with from as a content producer and as the line editor of GURPS?
Okay, well, if you're a role player who's tuned in and listened to us for 90 minutes, you've never played GURPS before. I think the thing I'd like you to take away is probably that we understand that it's a humongous game with tons of investment required to really get any good at it and understand it, to use it. And we've also realized that that's a whole lot like asking people to make a humongous buy-in to maybe not even like the game. That's true of any game where there's a huge investment. So this box is kind of our effort to show you can enjoy this game without necessarily spending all your money on this game, and without necessarily spending all your time learning this game, without devoting an entire corner of your your home to having books for this game, and also to get away from a little bit from the stuff that's maybe seemed over complex or perhaps too detailed for what you want out of a game. If you are a GURPS player and you've played GURPS before, what this is indeed a refinement of what you may already know that will hopefully help you get your friends into the game and will hopefully give you a way of playing that doesn't require you to constantly be referring to all of GURPS. You sort of cut loose and just do this. At the same time, I've gone for compatibility, so you can certainly use all your GURPS stuff with it. You're not going to be left out in the cold. And in either group, no matter which one you belong to, this is a physical product, not a digital one. So it's us showing you that in addition to Munchkin cards and other games we make, which we love, they're fun and cool, we can do an RPG that's fun and interesting, and you can hold in your hand, and it's going to compete with other games you can hold in your hand. So you're no longer having to weigh, well, gee, I can get into GURPS, but it means all these digital products. Now it's like, hey, no, I got GURPS right here. I got your GURPS right here. You can actually hit your friend upside the head with it if you really want. Which I consider a charm of any box, actually. And you'll know that if you support this Kickstarter right now, you're making sure that this will go forward, that there'll be more of this kind of thing in the future. You're also supporting a company which has traditionally been very, I think, very gamer-oriented, very gamer-positive. We're not one of these companies where you go into the company, no one actually plays the games, and there's a huge number of faceless people, and they're mostly not interested. We're all a bunch of geeky people who like this, and we're just admitting with this Kickstarter, yeah, doing an RPG really well is kind of expensive, and we've been out of RPGs in print for a while, and we need your help to do it right. And the dollars are going to be buying the doing it right factor, not the they're not going to be lining our pockets and making us rich. No one's ever got rich in this industry. And the other thing you'll be backing with a Kickstarter, from my point of view, is you'll be telling me that you're out there and you're actually interested in fantasy in its own right. You're interested in fun games. You're interested in quick games. You're interested in games that maybe get away from the walls of text that GURPS has become associated with. And it's important to tell me that because I don't make all the decisions by any means, but I do have a significant influence over who writes what and what gets written and what gets produced. And if this matters to you, if you really want this kind of stuff to be the way it goes in the future, then there's no better way to send a message than to vote with $1. And lastly, the fact that Steve Jackson Games has been in business for a long time. We have been out there, conventions, we've been gaming with you guys, been having our Men in Black going around. This will show us that you have, if you speak to us through your dollars, this will show us that perhaps been neglecting something, which is printed role-playing games that you consider important. And it's not just GURPS that will be impacted by this. I mean, the whole company will have to think, okay, so there's real dollars in fantasy gaming still, there's real dollars in role-playing still, there's real dollars in box role-playing games still. There's people who are still interested in that stuff. There's people still Steve Jackson Games. They see Steve Jackson Games as a source for that kind of stuff. We have to think about that. So that's the marketing people you'd be talking to there, not me. But still, so if it matters to you that Steve Jackson Games does RPGs, if it matters to you that physical games in your shelf, if it matters to you that there's more than card games, or if it matters to you that the card games coexist with role-playing games, if it matters to you that you see Steve Jackson Games logos on big old boxes on your shelf because you like that, and you have a slot that needs one more game, that logo on it, if any of these things matter to you, then I encourage you to come out and support. If you're new to us, you don't know who Steve Jackson Games is from Hole in the Wall, hopefully I've talked enough about gaming in the last hour and a half to let you realize that it's a real passion. It's not just something we're kind of doing to make a buck. Again, no one got rich doing this stuff. Maybe you'll give us a shot, give us a whirl. I'm available on forums, online. I'm always around. I answer questions, really fiddly questions like, which knife is longer, and do I get +1 to do this thing? That's the kind of support we provide. So when you get into us, you get into our games, you get into this game in particular, you're getting into a well-supported game with a strong community and staff and creators who actually show up, step up to the plate, and really answer your questions, however geeky they may be, because look at me. Anyway, so that's where we're at. So hopefully that doesn't sound too much like a "give me your money" appeal, and more like a "hey, I'd be really cool if you came in and were part of our gang" kind of pitch.
That's excellent. Sean, I want to thank you again for spending an hour and a half with me. And I really appreciate taking time to answer the questions. And I will see how quickly we can get this online. There will be a video. There will be a MP3. Those will happen fairly quickly. And then we'll try and get it transcribed, because you and I both, I was born in the Northeast of the United States. You're in Montreal. And so we both talk really fast. So between that and limits of technology, I think that the transcript will be a good thing in this particular interview. So I want to, again, thank you. And thank you for joining us on the firing squad if you've been watching.